Justin Fields and Russell Wilson might need new teams. We're headed towards the NFL free agency timeline of the offseason, and we've got some big names on the market. The reigning defensive star of the Super Bowl champions, an aging quarterback, but most importantly for fantasy purposes, some young wide receivers, and perhaps the breakout tight end of 2024. And we've got Sauce Gardner playing GM on Twitter. We've got it all covered today. This is Player Profiler Today, your favorite off-season show featured by Player Profiler, starting now. Welcome back to Player Profiler Today. I'm your Tuesday host, Ahan, at Ahan Rungta, for those of you who do want to follow on Twitter. We are in the offseason officially, and this is my second time on the show. If you aren't familiar with the timeline of Player Profiler Today, we run every single day of the offseason, and we've got a new host every single day. Shout out to all my other awesome co-hosts. Privileged to do this show with them. We've got Bradley Stalter, we've got Jack Kavanaugh, the czar of this show. We've got Toomey, who was on yesterday for the Monday show. This is February 20th, Tuesday. This is that edition. If you are listening to this as a podcast later on in the week, we recommend you all join us on YouTube, on the Player Profiler News channel, as well as on Twitter. We've got people in the chat so that you could join us and ask your questions, such as Jamie in the chat. Good to see you, Jamie. You can ask your questions in chat on the live shows, and we can talk about your teams, your fantasy teams or your real-life teams, and talk everything relevant in the news of the National Football League. And sometimes I'll screen share because there's some pretty entertaining content, especially in the off-season. So join us on stream every single day of the offseason at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, 4 p.m. Pacific, wherever you may be in the world. Join us every night. Today, we've got free agency on the agenda, and we've got some quarterbacks that may need new teams, and I want to start there. Justin Fields and Russell Wilson, Vegas certainly thinks they're headed elsewhere. Because you look at the market for Russell Wilson, and the Pittsburgh Steelers are now the overwhelming favorite for Russell Wilson to play his first snap of the 2024 season. Very key that we read the wording here. This is not the next team if he is traded. This is the Pittsburgh Steelers are minus 250 to be the team where Russell Wilson takes his first snap of the season, which means Vegas thinks he's out of here. He's out of Denver. Shout out Anthony in the chat, an OG of all the shows that I've been on Player Profiler. So we talk about Russell Wilson, and we take a bird's eye view of the kind of season he had under Sean Payton. The Broncos, some would call them disappointing. Some would call them, just who we thought they were. I actually thought Russell Wilson started off the season decently, but it just turned out as the season went along that it was a brutal watch for the Broncos, because Russell Wilson just simply isn't that guy anymore where, he can take a good roster and turn them into a Super Bowl contender. That's just not in his bag anymore. And Russell Wilson still got a good arm, but the truth of the situation is he was just average last season, especially as the season went along. Number 9 in true completion percentage, sure. Number 3 in completion percentage under pressure, but number 17 in completion percentage in a clean pocket. Number 9 in true passer rating, but it gets ugly on his deep ball. Russell Wilson been a deep ball guy his whole career. Number 19 in accuracy rating in a clean pocket, and number 18 in deep ball catchable pass rate. Number 14 in catchable pass rate overall. This is a guy who isn't quite as mobile as he once was. This is a guy who isn't quite the deep thrower he once was. And he just seems to be an okay starting level NFL quarterback everywhere he goes. And it makes sense that the Pittsburgh Steelers would think that he's an upgrade, because they had been in between starting Mason Rudolph and Kenny Pickett going in next season. And that statement by itself is just ugly to say out loud. And frankly, with no disrespect to either of those quarterbacks, neither of those moved the needle. Toomey talked a little bit on yesterday's show about that Pittsburgh Steelers quarterback situation, and it seems that Vegas, who's always sharper than us, Vegas thinks that it's going to be neither of them. It could be Russell Wilson as of now taking the first snap for the Steelers. And I will gladly. This is not a take show. This is not wake and take. If you want takes galore, head to our morning shows with Jason Allwine. But I think we could all come to an agreement that the Pittsburgh Steelers will need a lot more than just an upgrade from Kenny Pickett to Russell Wilson to be serious contenders next year. So Russell Wilson heading from slightly below mediocre to mediocre could move the needle in the NFL a little, but definitely would move the needle a bit in fantasy, especially if you are a George Pickens shareholder. I would think that the upgrade does help because Russell Wilson, he loves targeting those deep threats, those jump ball guys. He's done it his whole career, and he tried to do it to an extent last year as well with Courtland Sutton. And Courtland Sutton, good football player, but in that Broncos offense, just not much ceiling there. So if you're seeking for an added floor to George Pickens, maybe Russell Wilson is the guy you want, but certainly not the most exciting situation. Perhaps a slightly more needle-moving name is Justin Fields. And Justin Fields, another guy in contention to be the Steelers' new quarterback in 2024, as the Steelers are now the second in odds to land Justin Fields. And again, in the same market on Vegas, which is for which team will Justin Fields take his first snap of the 2024 regular season. The Steelers are plus 350, but the Atlanta Falcons are the favorite, and it's not as heavy of a favorite as the Russell Wilson situation, but they are minus money at minus 130 for Justin Fields to bring that athleticism at the quarterback position. If you are a stockholder of Falcons players, I'm not sure Justin Fields is the guy you want, and maybe that's an unpopular take, but there's only so much Justin Fields can carry for a fantasy offense. We talk about Arthur Smith all the time, rightfully so. Raheem Morris said in his press conference when he was hired as the Falcons head coach, we talked about this last week, Raheem Morris said, when I see this Falcons offense, I see playmakers, and he named specifically Drake London and Bijan Robinson. First off, there are already a lot of mouths to feed. There are a lot of good athletic bodies in that team with London and Robinson, but also Kyle Pitts in the mix, who, don't forget, he's still a first-round NFL draft pick with a ton of talent, a highly efficient player when he does see targets. Great athlete. So Justin Fields, his greatest attribute is always going to be the legs. So could it be an exciting scenario for the Falcons to potentially win a division down the line with the upgrade from Desmond Ridder, who was frankly one of the worst quarterbacks in the NFL of the starting position last year, to Justin Fields? Absolutely. Justin Fields could come to Atlanta and win them a division. But for fantasy purposes, that would only cause more of a cluster. Would increase the week-to-week ceilings for Drake London and Bijan Robinson. But what else? A lot can happen in this offseason with the draft and, of course, with free agency, which will be what the rest of the show is going to be about. We'll talk about free agency. And if you have questions in chat about your own team, about players who are on your dynasty teams, or any fantasy players you want to talk about for people who are in chat live with us right now, go ahead, drop those questions so we can talk about the players you want to talk about. We'll start with the biggest name on the board, and I got to give a shout out at this point to Theo Greminger, our content czar at PlayerProfiler, the man Theo. He has written an article. You can check it out on playerprofiler.com/articles. He has written an article ranking the top offensive players in free agency for the 2024 season. Of course, if you are a fantasy player, you want to see who these top guys are and what potential moves could happen. Go check out this article. And we will walk through some of the names of this article. Theo has given us actually 22 names that he thinks are going to be extremely relevant for the fantasy scheme. So go to playerprofiler.com/articles and check out the written content there. And number one on this list, as Anthony in chat brings up, is Kirk Cousins. Kirk Cousins, 35 years old. And, of course, he injures his Achilles at the midway point of the season. Kirk Cousins, a huge candidate to re-sign with the Minnesota Vikings. Minnesota loves a lot of the things he does for them, which, for fantasy purposes, honestly, I don't blame Minnesota for the fact that Kirk Cousins is what you would call a Hall of Fame feed-your alpha quarterback. And it's an underrated skill in the NFL for sure to be able to make sure that your best players get the ball. And Kirk Cousins has absolutely made sure that Justin Jefferson and TJ Hawkinson have gotten their fair share of targets, especially in the red zone, over the course of his Minnesota Vikings career. So Kirk Cousins does a lot of good things that keeps him a viable starter in the NFL. But we dive a little bit more into Kirk Cousins' ceiling and whether he could make this team a Super Bowl contender. And that's where you could draw the line. Kirk Cousins, a fine starter in the NFL. But can he elevate? Number 21 in red zone completion percentage last season, despite all those weapons. Number 1 in pressured catchable pass rate, so he is getting the ball out and he's getting them to weapons. Number 15 in deep ball catchable pass rate, though, and we all know the struggles in prime time, which I don't think at this point is coincidence. I think the man simply struggles when the lights are bright. And it's going to be a big decision for Minnesota to see what they do at the quarterback position. I personally think, as well as Theo thinks, that Kirk will re-sign with Minnesota. Is that in the best interest of the future of the Vikings? Probably not. Jamie says in chat, Wake and Take this morning, Jason talked about the possibility of the Browns letting Chubb go. Do you think he stays, or what team could you see him going to as a relevant fantasy running back? Great question about the running backs, because we have an interesting offseason for the running back class. And right before we address that, I will address a couple of the other names on the running back market this offseason. And before we get into this Chubb stuff, by the way, just sounds crazy, so pause that statement. But Saquon Barkley, number 5 on Theo's list for fantasy impact offensive players this offseason for good reason. Saquon Barkley still just 27 years old. And yes, he has hit this running back age apex, so to speak. But New York, they could choose to franchise tag Barkley. They could extend him. But there's always the possibility the Giants seek another route and say, you know what? We think running backs don't matter all that much. And you can have your way at free agency. And if that happens, Saquon Barkley could be an early front runner for the guy you want to draft in the late first round of your fantasy drafts. And in some cases, he could maybe end up potentially being an early second round draft pick, in which case I'm already calling it. He's going to be a value if that happens, because if the man stays healthy, the guy still has insane talent. And he was showing it even last season. He's been through a variety of injuries, but let's not forget the man was the second overall pick in the NFL draft for a reason. And last year, the peripherals were still good. Breakaway run rate, number 15 ranked. He had 12 breakaway runs. As a receiver, still getting it done. They needed him out of the backfield, number 5 in route rate, which in route participation. So he could catch passes out of the backfield. He could still be productive out of the ground, and a viable landing spot for him, and perhaps the dream landing spot for him. I could see the Houston Texans looking at Saquon Barkley if he hits the open market. We already know, we've talked about extensively on Player Profiler podcast about this Houston Texans offense. They're getting Tank Dell back, as Toomey talked about yesterday. And they're obviously going to have C.J. Stroud and Nico Collins in that strong connection for a very long time. Love what DeMeco Ryans is doing with the Texans defense as well, the direction he's taking them. They won a playoff game in C.J. Stroud's rookie year. Things are only going to get better from here. And a clear glaring spot on their offense is no reliable running back, as they were relying on just Devin Singletary, who's just not an explosive guy at all. So I could see Saquon Barkley just completely shifting the fantasy landscape by landing on the Houston Texans. Also talk about Josh Jacobs, and Josh Jacobs was my number one fade in 2023 fantasy football drafts because he was coming off a season where he led the NFL in touches, and that's always going to be the case. You're going to want to fade players that come off a high usage season like that at the running back position. But it's still worth noting that Jacobs did have some productive games, and Jacobs can still play in this league. And a very on-brand landing spot for him would be the Cowboys. The Cowboys, obviously, they saw what they had with Tony Pollard as a starter all of last season, and honestly, it wasn't pretty. Tony Pollard fighting to get those first downs just wasn't doing it at the rate that Prime Zeke was. Tony Pollard, the prototypical great, explosive fantasy athlete, if you can draft him as a handcuff, but just maybe not a workhorse in this league. So I could see the Dallas Cowboys trying to stay on brand and go after that experienced running back in Josh Jacobs. And speaking of experience, Derrick Henry is most likely going to be on the move. A fine career with the Tennessee Titans, but the Tennessee Titans obviously changing direction. They changed head coach already. Head coach Brian Callahan could ask for Derrick Henry to return, but the man is 30 years old, right? And Henry, if he's trying to chase a Super Bowl ring, let's face it, he doesn't want to go back to the Tennessee Titans. There were some contenders for a Derrick Henry trade last season, including the Baltimore Ravens and, for a little bit, the Buffalo Bills, the Philadelphia Eagles have also been in the mix for this. But Henry is certainly entering, as Theo calls it, the final chapter. So for Derrick Henry, a lot of decisions to make, and he would need a perfect landing spot to be very relevant in fantasy, but it could certainly happen. On the running back topic, Tony Pollard, we just talked about how he just completely failed as everybody's fantasy darling in the early rounds of drafts. He's just not a workhorse in this league. We've seen enough. Good pass catcher, okay runner, but just not a workhorse, not prime Zeke by any means. But there are so many running backs on this free agency pool. You have to mention Tony Pollard potentially being on the move as well. And if that happens, it'll be curious to see what the Cowboys want to do at running back. DeAndre Swift, another explosive athlete. Can we talk about how DeAndre Swift is still just age 25? And if Jalen Hurts was not a 90% tush-push guy, if he was even a 75% tush-push guy, DeAndre Swift would be an RB1 in 2023. DeAndre Swift absolutely screwed in generational fashion by the brotherly shoves, or whatever you want to call those quarterback sneaks in Philadelphia. If that quarterback sneak is not as historically efficient as it was, we're talking about DeAndre Swift being a first-round fantasy pick next year. So it would be interesting to see if DeAndre Swift comes back to Philly, and if so, that Philly offense is still a potent offense, and they're making changes in the coaching staff. So DeAndre Swift is my favorite running back free agent to watch. And speaking of running back free agents to watch, we also have 29-year-old Austin Eckler, who just simply, friend of the program, friend of the fantasy football community, A-plus individual. He actually mentioned me on his podcast, and we love him for that. But as a player, he admitted it before last year. He said, hey, man, when I run, it hurts. And that kind of summarizes what Austin Eckler is in this league at this point. He was undrafted for a reason. He isn't prime Derrick Henry by any means. He never was. Definitely a great fantasy asset with his ability to catch passes out of the backfield for a while. But Eckler, it is possible that we have seen the last of Eckler's fantasy relevant days in the NFL. And that is just the truth about the not for long league, aka the NFL. One more name on Theo's list of top free agents circling back to Devin Singletary of the Houston Texans. I covered most of this. Is the Houston Texans have been through a very short cycle of running backs over the last few seasons after they had to move on from David Johnson. They tried their hand at Dameon Pierce, who was everybody's fantasy darling, except those who downloaded our breakout finder and just knew that Dameon Pierce was not that guy. If you listened to our advice there and did not put all your chips into Dameon Pierce, you know this. Dameon Pierce is not that guy. He's never going to be a workhorse in this league. He could be a solid handcuff. He's still got athleticism. He runs like Chris Carson in his prime, sure. He's exciting for best ball formats as a late round sleeper in some formats, but Dameon Pierce is not going to take over this backfield. It's over for him. Devin Singletary, age 26, okay player, maybe a starter in the NFL, maybe not. So Devin Singletary rounds that out. And now to come back to this question, which was about the possibility of the Browns letting Nick Chubb go. Of course, Nick Chubb with a brutal primetime injury, in the season, and the Browns could make Nick Chubb a cap casualty this offseason, given how much money they have spent already on a certain quarterback who is never going to live up to his contract. And Nick Chubb, of course, when healthy, one of the best pure runners in the NFL before that injury. Now, is he going to come back and be that guy? The Browns would be smart to just assume not and let the 28-year-old Nick Chubb go. And if that happens, I could see a lot of fringe NFL teams who perhaps think that running backs matter more than they do look to go after a guy like Nick Chubb who could be a workhorse if they like what they see from him post-recovery. The Buffalo Bills come up as an interesting candidate for Nick Chubb. And you look at the Nick Chubb contract situation, and I like to use Spotrac for stuff like this. You look at the contract situation, unrestricted free agent next year at age 30 in 2025. So obviously this is going to be a one-year move for whoever's trying to get some Nick Chubb. I'm gonna continue saying what I said all of last season, is that James Cook has the ability to have a Cinderella 5-week span at any point in the fantasy football season. But this man is not a workhorse. He's never been a workhorse. He is a guy that is a merchant of being in a good Buffalo Bills offense. If the Buffalo Bills enter the season as James Cook as their only reliable running back, I don't think the Buffalo Bills will be happy with that. And for that reason, I think that if they look to get a true number one running back and make James Cook a second and third down back, a kind of gadget, maybe lining up at wide receiver a little bit, if the Buffalo Bills choose that route, I could totally see it. I could see the Bills going after Nick Chubb. We also have a question about the Bears. Do you see the Bears picking up a running back, or is it going to be Roshan Herbert's show in Chicago? If the Bears were smart, and I could have tied this into the Justin Fields conversation, which is that the Bears absolutely have to trade Justin Fields and they have to draft Caleb Williams at number 1 overall. If the Chicago Bears were smart, they would not go after more and more running backs, and they should focus on the rest of their team, focus on the wide receiver position to help Caleb Williams the way the Houston Texans help CJ Stroud. And they should rely on Roshan and Herbert as a duo, because that duo is good. Now, again, there's a difference between having a good running back committee and saying that one of your running backs is an alpha. And maybe we fall in love a little too much with calling running backs alpha too quickly, kind of like we did with Tony Pollard. And I don't think Khalil Herbert nor Roshan Johnson are alphas in this league per se, but that committee is quite solid. Don't forget that Khalil Herbert was a 96th percentile college yards per carry guy, 53rd percentile college dominator guy. And last season, in the limited opportunities that he did get, he was number 21 in juke rate, number 12 in breakaway run rate. So he is certainly explosive. And as well as Roshan Johnson, who kind of came into his own as he got more of a role. Roshan Johnson, a guy that the breakout finder loved last year in the 2023 class. So Roshan and Herbert together, I think, is a very good running back committee. So I think the Bears would be smart to not bother with that position for a while. More running back questions. Which running back do you think will fit best on the Vikings? Do they get one in free agency or the draft? We all know Alexander Mattison is not the answer. Shout out Jamie, who understands the agenda that Alexander Mattison is not it. And I'd like to apologize once again to Alexander Madison's father, who has seen my tweets. It's nothing personal. We're a fantasy brand. We're trying to help people win fantasy leagues. Nothing personal. The Minnesota Vikings, we talk about them potentially re-signing Kirk Cousins. They would be smart to not overspend on a star running back. They don't need a star running back. They have Justin Jefferson. They have TJ Hawkinson. They have Jordan Addison. The only running back that would make a huge impact in this league really is Christian McCaffrey. We know the deal with Christian McCaffrey. He's not up for grabs for Minnesota. They would be smart to pick up a running back in the draft, and I think that's what they would do. I don't think Minnesota will stop looking for answers at running back no matter how they get it. They have shown that they will look, everywhere they could find. They worked out Kareem Hunt in the middle of last season. And let's not forget, they still have got Tykavius Chandler, who still has problems with blocking, but certainly one of those guys that could be explosive and be a huge part of a backfield. So I think Minnesota should focus on other positions and get a running back in the draft, someone that can complement Tykavius Chandler in a committee. And that's what I think they could do. I want to talk about some of the headliners of NFL free agency and some of my favorite names before we end this relatively short player profiler today. I want to talk about a few names that stand out to me that could change the landscape of fantasy football. And it starts with Sauce Gardner. And Sauce Gardner ain't a GM. Why is Han bringing up Sauce Gardner? Well, if you haven't kept track of Sauce Gardner this week on Twitter, you might have missed a little bit because Sauce Gardner, he has turned into LeSauce, as he likes to call himself. He has turned into GM mode. And if you are live with us right now, I am screen sharing Sauce Gardner's Twitter. As, of course, looks like he is live on Twitch right now. Maybe join the stream after this. But looks like he has gone into full LeSauce mode, as he calls himself. And funnily enough, he made a tweet. LeSauce is finally back. For all that you don't know, that's my recruiting name. And look, your boy got one of the top comments on this tweet. Post a Mike Evans gif. Lo and behold, Mike Evans reports and Sauce Gardner heavily involved in asking the fans who y'all want, and keeps mentioning Mike Evans as a big name for the New York Jets to target. Wants to get Aaron Rodgers some of that help. We also see Breece Hall active on Twitter a little bit, not as much as Sauce, but we look at Breece Hall's most recent likes, and he liked this tweet, which mentions Mike Evans as a list of contracts that are about to void, and then he also quote tweets it and puts a little smiley face. Certainly interesting that the Jets are going in full recruit mode. DJ Reader also made some tweets. Mike Evans to the Jets, a certain possibility, and I'll just call it right now. I think it happens. I think Mike Evans heads to the Jets, and that overexcites half of the fantasy community because Mike Evans to the Jets would be good for the Jets, obviously. With, everything they have with the construction of their roster, they need another wide receiver. And if you want to hear a little bit more about how much they need more help offensively, I took the Jets under on wins, regular season wins last season. And yes, of course, they wouldn't have had the same record if they had Aaron Rodgers instead of, what they had to deal with. Of course, they would have won a little more. But one of the reasons I was not a believer in the Jets, and, people say, we had no way to tell if Aaron Rodgers played. I disagree. I think we do know what would have happened if Aaron Rodgers had played the full season. They still wouldn't have been great. Aaron Rodgers, we talk about what he has done recently, and the MVPs are great. That happened, a few years ago. It's not that far away, but you look at their pass catching core, and I mentioned in my article for futures bets, and I mentioned outside of Garrett Wilson, this support staff is simply still not good enough unless you have a guy like Patrick Mahomes or Josh Allen or Lamar Jackson. And the fact of the matter is Aaron Rodgers is not on that tier anymore. Aaron Rodgers closing in on 40 years old, nowhere near reliable as he once was. In his first season without Devontae Adams since 2013, which was his last season with the Packers, among all qualified quarterbacks, Aaron Rodgers ranked number 12 in accuracy rating, but number 21 in true completion rate, number 26 in clean pocket completion rate, number 47 in catchable pass rate. So you take into account his drop-off and efficiency as a thrower, and you look at the rest of the weapons right now, and there's not much there. You could argue that Jeremy Ruckert is the second best pass catcher on the Jets. Well, if you don't count the backfield, I would consider Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall as the big two of that offense. And then who's third? They might need Mike Evans. So that's good for the Jets, but not great if you're a believer in Mike Evans' fantasy stonks. Mike Evans has the potential to be saying goodbye to his fantasy elite days, and that's not a jab at how good Mike Evans has been over the course of his career, and not even a jab at how good Mike Evans still is. And the fact of the matter is, he's still a solid wide receiver in the NFL, but he's not prime Devontae Adams. He's not Justin Jefferson. This is a guy who still relies on a quarterback feeding him at a high rate, and there are a lot of potential landing spots that could help teams, but not help his fantasy managers, such as the Carolina Panthers being involved with wide receiver. I don't want Mike Evans, connected to Bryce Young. I don't want Mike Evans to be in a Jets offense that simply might not be good and still would need to prioritize Garrett Wilson. I think Mike Evans, we have maybe seen the last of his big fantasy days. Jamie says in chat, Ruckert is one of my most owned dynasty stashes. You know ball, Jamie. I love Jeremy Ruckert. I actually do like him as a player. Speaking of wide receivers, the other, big name I do want to bring up is, and I say big name because this is a fantasy show, and let's be clear. This is a Player Profiler is by nature, by heart, a fantasy football platform, but we're here to talk about the entire league and everything related to the NFL. So I do need to be calm when I say Gabe Davis, big name for fantasy, but maybe not a big name in the NFL, because Gabe Davis, man, look at what he was doing on Instagram today. He thinks he's slick. He is trying to gas himself up. Shout out to all the agent talk. I made a tweet about this earlier today. Gabe Davis made almost a 10-minute tribute video to his career in Buffalo. And of course, he had his great moments in Buffalo. He had his huge games. The 3-touchdown game against the Chiefs in the playoffs, probably the highlight of his career. And he goes on Instagram and posts a tribute video for himself and ends it with a bunch of stats. And I want to, for those of you who are podcast listeners, I want to read off some of these stats. 78.9% first down rate, first in the NFL. And by the way, as I read this, I wonder who collected these stats for him. 17.8% touchdown rate, first in the NFL. 16.3 yards average depth of target, ADOT, first in the NFL. 17.3 yards per reception, first in the NFL. 45% explosive reception rate, first in the NFL. 33 touchdowns on 336 targets, 10th in the NFL. 15.8% target rate, 47th in the NFL. And then a new slide, wide receivers averaging 800-plus receiving yards, 8-plus touchdowns, and 17-plus games per season. CeeDee Lamb, my boy DK Metcalf, Mike Evans, Stephon Diggs, Tyreek Hill, and Gabe Davis, and more. It doesn't stop here. Goes through a tirade about his 2022 to 2022 playoffs. First in the NFL in receptions that are first downs or touchdowns at 56.8%. First in the NFL in every 3.5 catches are touchdowns, which is just, I'm sorry, to whoever made this graphic, all love to you. If this is not the definition of awkward graphic, I don't know what is. Most touchdowns ever in first 3 seasons for a day 3 drafted wide receiver, passing Tyreek Hill, KC with 25. I mean, if this is not glazing, as the kids call it, I don't know what is. Self-glazing is crazy. Gabe Davis, Mr. Davis, all love to you. You seem like a great dude. You've done nothing wrong to me. And you've definitely not heard me because I enjoyed passing up on you in drafts this season. Over the last 2 seasons, I've enjoyed passing up on drafts and watching my opponents play you against me. So no shade to you, man. Here's who you are, according to the player profiler metrics. Number 46 in true catch rate, number 62 in yards per route run, number 60 in quarterback rating per target, number 126 in route win rate. Mr. Davis, you can't separate. When you get targets downfield, you're not efficient at snagging them. All that while playing with a top 3 quarterback in the National Football League in Josh Allen. So, Mr. Davis, I respect the gassing yourself up, but let's be honest, whichever team overpays for you is probably not going to be a happy camper. I'm going to predict that the Carolina Panthers continue to be the Carolina Panthers and sign Gabe Davis to pair with Bryce Young, and that is going to be an absolute delight of a disaster to watch. Jamie says, do you think Gabe Davis to the Chargers would be great for fantasy? Where do you want him to land? I want him to land on any team that my Patriots face very often. So I want him to land in the division, ideally like the Jets or the Dolphins. Even the Bills. I don't mind him re-signing with the Bills. I want him to stay in this division because I love when the Patriots have a chance to win games because Gabe Davis is out there doing nothing. And specifically on a more serious note related to the Chargers, I think Justin Herbert is going to be elevated to a new level. He's a good quarterback. He's going to be elevated to a new level under John Harbaugh. And one of the ways to do that is to give him real good wide receivers, which they can do in this draft because this draft class is so deep at the wide receiver position. There are studs in this draft, which we'll probably talk about over the course of the next couple of months on the show. And the answer is not Gabe Davis. They do not need to sign Gabe Davis. Anthony says the Panthers need to sign bigger free agents than Gabe have cap room now. Absolutely, they have cap room now. And I will make the last name on this show perhaps my favorite fantasy relevant free agent of 2024. If y'all have guesses, if you're watching in the chat, who I've not revealed this on Twitter, I've not revealed it on the show yet. A person I have not named so far on the show today. My favorite offensive player for fantasy purposes who is a free agent this offseason. A pivotal move would be to sign this guy. Let me know in the YouTube chat or the Twitter chat, wherever you are. Let me know who you think I'm talking about as I'm talking about it. This name is going to absolutely change the fantasy landscape at his position. I'm talking about a guy who is a premium athlete, someone who has perhaps one of the most impressive profiles that we have on our player profiler database at his position. In his class, he ranked number 1 in athleticism score at his position. He has a 98th percentile 40-yard dash, 97th percentile speed score, 97th percentile burst score, 99th percentile catch radius. He is a first-round draft pick in the NFL, and at a position where really, in the long run, all you should do is target, no pun intended, target premium athletes. Y'all know who I'm talking about yet. I'll talk a little bit more. 24% dominator rating or above, which is called, a premium production in college guy. We just talked about his super athletic profile. His best comparable on Player Profiler is a guy that many consider a Hall of Famer and someone that has just played in a Super Bowl. 27th percentile college dominator, and he was second on his team in targets in his second NFL season. He's a free agent. And oh, by the way, he's still just 26 years old. We have no correct guesses in chat. I'm talking about the thumbnail of this episode, Noah Fant. Noah Fant is someone who we've been waiting since he got drafted in the first round of the NFL draft. Give us a complete season of breaking out. Give us that full season of being that guy that we're all excited to watch and start every day in our fantasy lineups at the tight end position, at a position that is so volatile and at a position where you can score a touchdown every other week and just simply dominate your fantasy league because you drafted him late. We've been waiting for him to be the league winner at tight end. And it could happen this year if he gets a good landing spot. David Njoku, Evan Engram, what do these guys all have in common? They broke out eventually. They had slow starts to their careers, but they broke out eventually because they're elite athletic profiles who eventually got their opportunity. They found their way through the ranks. Give me a good landing spot for Noah Fant. We don't even need an elite landing spot like the Chargers, because the Chargers, they're potentially going to draft Brock Bowers in the first round. They already have Donald Parham. I don't need an elite landing spot like the Chargers, excuse me. But give me a decent landing spot where in a pass-first offense, could he run it back in Seattle? Potentially, but I don't think he does. Give us the Cincinnati Bengals, who have not had a good tight end in a while. Theo mentions them in the chat. And Jamie, right on cue, do you think Irv Smith ever breaks out? No. What a segue, Jamie. Just talking about the Cincinnati Bengals, and you bring up Irv Smith, because Irv Smith just simply not the most impressive athletic profile. I have never been a fan of Irv Smith's fantasy stocks. It has not panned out yet on a Minnesota Vikings team that was missing TJ Hawkinson for before the TJ Hawkinson move. He was still not super productive. He got some red zone targets out of necessity from the Bengals this year and still didn't produce because, let's face it, he's just not that good. On the show today, we talked about running backs. We talked about LeSauce getting Mike Evans potentially. We talked about Gabe Davis. We talked about Kirk Cousins. And we just talked about my favorite free agent of the 2024 class, Noah Fant. I appreciate y'all, as always, for hanging in chat with me. If you're listening on podcast, don't forget to join us every single day of the offseason. I am your host, Ahan Rungta, the Tuesday host for Player Profiler today. Signing off. I will personally see you next Tuesday, but we will see you for Player Profiler today, tomorrow on Wednesday, February 21st.